And thanks for everybody for coming here, also for Kino Kania to set this all up very beautifully. Let me see how we're going to do this. I think if I press this button, does this work? Or is it the next one? Yeah? Yeah. See, my nieces made this very, very nice. Actually, it's very simple. Press the button more. Why did I write this book? The story was I came in 1990 as a backpacker in Indonesia. A family literally took me in. I stayed there for 6 months. I learned Indonesian. When they did puasa, they had Ramadan, I joined them in. When they had family birthdays or feasts or whatever, I joined with them. So I lived in South Jakarta and I found it an absolutely fantastic experience. So eventually I discovered that my own family had actually arrived there in the 1650s. A young lady, one wonders what she had to do there in those days. But anyway, that's a different story altogether. I wrote a book about Jakarta. I got into writing, and by that time I was already, I would say, really interested in Majapahit and decided that I really wanted to go dive into it. So for a couple of years, 3 or 4 years, me and my wife and friends, we visited hundreds of temples, been to East Java all over the place, spoken with all kinds of people to try to get a picture of it. And as you rightly say, there are big holes in it, it's like Swiss cheese. There's a lot we don't know, and we've used a bit of imagination to try to figure out what might well have happened at times. Next one. So what we're going to talk about is a bit where it is, what it is. I'm going to highlight somebody whom I think is really important in the story, but even in Indonesia doesn't really get a lot of attention, although the cat of the new Indonesian president, Prabowo, he's a cat lover, has got the same name, called Kata Negara. So clearly the president likes him as well. I'm going to talk a bit about him. Then a bit about what Majapahit was, and I'd like you to give kind of an overview story of what Majapahit was. So by the end of this, you walk away and think, okay, I get a bit of a history lesson out of this as well. And what Majapahit really is for today. The next slide. So first we're going to talk about the timeline. One more. Tick. First we're going to talk about the timeline. So very quickly, Borobudur, that's 850. 900. Promenade also. Kedah, I actually just went to Kedah last couple of days. That is 700s up till 1400s. So that's all before Majapahit. Majapahit starts actually, I think, in 1222. But I tell you a story that happened before that because it's important. And Majapahit proper as a place was built in 1292. And probably by 1527, it fell in decline. We'll talk a bit about why that is the case. And some of the Muslim empires that emerged on the northern part of Java took over and basically, presumably, burned the place down. Now, why do I start a little bit before that? Because there was a king around 1050 called Erland. And he did something that actually sets up, to a large extent, Javanese or maybe Malay history for centuries to come. He divides his kingdom, Jonggala, into two for two of his sons. Now, what happens with these two sons? They fight. So you get a split in the empire. But what he wanted to do is to make this split eternal. So he asked the magician, and you might believe this or not, but he asked the magician to take holy water from Bali, the guy did this, and fly over the lands and make a holy split in his own kingdom, Erlangga's kingdom. The guy duly did so. He flew over the lands, but he got stuck in a pohon asam, in a tamarind tree. And he couldn't finalize his job. He condemned the tree to never ever grow again. But this is important because the magical split of the lands was therefore never done. And therefore the unification of the lands can still be done. And if you want to do that, it had to be on that particular place where that tamarind tree stood. And that place is still there, and it's called Rurare. You can find it there. There's actually a Buddhist monastery there yet, and I'll show you in a little bit where that is and why that comes back into the story. Now, that's what happens over here. Then there is a kind of a robber, rapist, a really nasty sort of character that emerges. His name is Ken Arok, and he actually is the first in 1222 to put these kingdoms together. That is the kingdom of Singasari. That's pretty much now where Malang is in East Java. Now, we'll talk a bit about this as well. That kingdom eventually was also burned down. There's an invasion from the Mongols, the Mongol Empire, the Chinese. And in the process, as that Singasari kingdom and city is burned down, a new city rises, and they call it Majapahit. And that sets up the height of Majapahit Empire that was from 1292 all the way, maybe for about 100 years to say 1380, 1390, and then we see already signs of decline coming in, although maybe at that particular point in time the people themselves didn't really realize it, and they believed or they claimed that they had everything under control from pretty much southern Thailand, here Malaysia, Sumatra, Java, all the way to Irian Jaya. And I think to a certain extent that was probably the case. So that's the time frame, and then the Muslim Empire comes over and burns the thing down. So that's the real end of Majapahit. Next one. So where are we talking about? So this is Southeast Asia as it was in the 13th century. Malacca arguably wasn't really there yet, but maybe actually it was. I'll talk about this in a second. Next click. This is where Majapahit is, and you can see Singasari here as well. And click again, so we're going to zoom in on it. Here we are Majapahit, not far away from Surabaya. It's about an hour's drive actually from Surabaya. And click again. And here we go in, and then click once, and then twice. What you see here is Majapahit, Kediri and Singasari. Kediri and Singasari were the capitals of the two lands of the suns that were separated. You can see Majapahit is right in the center. So this, Majapahit, was on that center where that magician was flying and tried to separate the lands, but got stuck in this tree and was never able to do so. And my argument is that Majapahit was, the location of it was picked for spiritual sort of reasons. It was a sort of symbol for the unification of the lands. Now, unfortunately for the Minister of Tourism of East Java, Majapahit doesn't have a Borobudur or a Promenade or an Angkor Wat. For the size of its kingdom, it could have actually had one. And if you would have had one, it would be a kind of a place where people would go and travel and know about this. People know about Angkor Wat and go to Cambodia to see it. But if you actually go to what is Majapahit here now, there's a museum. To be honest, it's a bit of a letdown. And actually, if you want to go there, there's places to visit and I'll tell you where. But the museum itself, which is where the center was, there's not that much left, to be extremely frank. The thing is, there are many, many temples. The most impressive is close to Blitar, called Penataran. I think after the Borobudur and the Prambanan temple in Java, that is number 3 for me. That is an absolutely impressive place. If you ever have time to go there, please go there. But there are many, many temples, and I get back to this on this, because there was a reason why they didn't build one temple, but literally hundreds of smaller ones. But for the moment, we got the location sorted out, Majapahit, right here in East Java. Next slide. Now, if we can go deeper to Majapahit, this is where Majapahit is located, the palace. There's a big sort of pool that was built there, Segaran, and you can see Burane. If you click once, you get 2 places here, and try it. Okay, you can go back again, but it doesn't matter. Yeah. You can see Burane. So Majapahit is at the place where the tamarind tree stood. The kind of symbol of unification of the lands is where it was picked. It was far away from the big river, Brantas, and this is one of the downturns or problems that emerges over time already. It is not at a location where it can respond to shifts in trade that take place across the region. But at the very beginning, people could sail up the Brantas River here, and here in Canggu, which is now Mojokerto, there was a big sort of port where Arabs and Malay and Filipinos and Chinese and Indians all came and traded. And then it's a kind of a walk of about 3/4 of a day to the palace of Majapahit, further south. I also highlight here Bajangratu because it's a beautiful sort of symbol, a temple that if you go to the region, go and visit that. It's a really beautiful sort of entrance that is still standing there of a palace. We don't know really what it actually was, but it might have been a palace of one of the kings. Next one. This is just a beautiful picture to illustrate that we're going to the next sort of part of the story. And next one. We're going to start with that robber rapist kind of guy, Ken Arok. So around 1220, there is suddenly a man that emerges out of nowhere. He must have been 12, maybe 20, 25 years old, and he kills the king of Singasari, who lives there. At the time, Singasari didn't have a name yet, but let's not go there. He kills the king, takes that town over, and attacks the other side. So the 2 cities, Singasari and Kediri. Those were the 2 different cities that I showed you earlier on, the capitals of the two lands that were supposedly separated. And he unifies the lands and he starts a dynasty. That is the dynasty of Singasari, if you want to call it like that. The problem is, he's got a wife, Kentenes, beautiful lady. She actually was married with somebody else. She's got a child from somebody else. He says, that's not saying it to anybody. The child 20 years later finds out that Ken Arok is not his father, but actually the murderer of his biological father. It gets all really complex. It becomes an absolute mess because he kills his father. The true biological sons of Ken Arok say, well, you can't do that, we're going to kill you, so he kills them. And for about 30 years, it's an absolute mess, it's mayhem, Game of Thrones galore, absolutely. The guy who started this all, his name is Anusapati, and he set up a beautiful temple that is still there. And on the temple, you have an outsized Kala and big Naga heads. You have them always, but here they're bigger. Because he believed that he would not only, by killing Ken Arok, he knew he was going to be killed by the real sons of Ken Arok. But he thought, they might also come after me in the afterlife. So I need to protect myself in the afterlife. And therefore, he needed a good temple to ward these people off in the future life. Now, next one. Then we have a couple of generations where basically everybody wants to kill each other. And one of the great-grandsons of Ken Arok eventually stands up and says, listen, we need to stabilize this place. I am the king, but my son, my little son, 5-year-old, I appoint him as the king. His name was Kerta Negara. And because when he was 5 years old, he was already the king. By the time his father dies, he's 25 years old. Everybody's basically sees him as the legitimate king. And that allows for a sense of stability to emerge. Traders come in and one slide back. And what we see is that the arts are flourishing. I showed you this profile here. This is in the statues. There's a lady called Leslie Pullen. She's done a lot of work on this. In the statues, certainly in the Singasari days, so under the days of Kertanegara, we see that they move away from century-old motifs to all sorts of different motifs. And one of the motifs, a very simple motif, this, was only used by a royal family because if you had ceremonies with magical powers were being unleashed, you needed to protect yourself. And there was one particular motif on the dresses, Sinjang Kawung, that could protect yourself. And for a long time, that particular batik motif, later on that goes into batik, that particular motif, Sanjang Kawung, if you see these batiks, they look like kind of S's that are, or paragraph signs that are interlocking, you could say. These interlocking circles, that starts to emerge in those years. And later on, that becomes a very classical sort of batik thing. I think, I don't have it on my shirt, but I have another shirt which I should have put on now, come to realize, to illustrate that. But they became a sort of classic batik movement. But Kertanegara sets up the time, and the arts and the business and the economy, it's all flourishing. And the next slide, the unfortunate thing for him is that I think he set up for the greatness of the Majapahit that comes thereafter. But he actually didn't experience himself. He gets killed in the process soon thereafter. But he was king for about, say, maybe until the 1290s. So a good 30, 40 years he was in power. Just to illustrate how important he was, the big king at the peak of Majapahit, that comes about 60 years later, was a king called Hayam Wuruk. And his vizier was called Gajah Mada. Now Hayam Wuruk and Gajah Mada in Indonesia, at least at schools, they are referred to as the big people from Majapahit when everything was really good for us and stuff like that. So when Batavia became an Indonesian city, the Dutch had given up, the Japanese had left, they had to change the names of the cities, of the names of the streets to Indonesian names. The biggest streets in Jakarta, they became Jalan Gajah Mada and Jalan Hayam Wuruk. That's what you do. The big kings get the biggest sort of real estate. And this is Gajah Mada actually at the moment in North Jakarta. But if you go to what Kertanegara got, next slide, there's actually a very small street. There's a very small street in southern Jakarta and the outskirts. The funny thing is, Prabowo happens to live here. The reason why he called his cat Kertanegara is because he found him on the street, Jalan Kertanegara. But the guy he didn't really get any prominent real estate when they had to appoint people to streets in Jakarta. And that shows a little bit how important he was in their mindset, I would say. But actually, he was, I think, a big figure, an empire builder. Next one. Why? Because when he becomes king, his father dies, is an important uncle of him died. What he does, he realizes that he needs to consolidate his power domestically. And what he does is to ask the Hindu and the Buddhist heads of the religions, he says, you don't have to pay taxes. You can build the temples whatever you want. There's a couple of temples that will be royal temples. I'll take care of that. But the rest, you can do whatever you want. I'll leave you free. But you are loyal to me. That's the important thing. And that deal was made in a particular ceremony in a particular place called Sarwadharma in 1269. This picture's got nothing to do with it. I think it's just a nice picture to illustrate that, but it's got nothing really to do with it, but it shows the story to a certain extent. He is able to consolidate his power therefore domestically. And this is one of the reasons why there are not so many big temples there. Every small constituency had their own right to build their own temple. So you end up with hundreds of small temples, whereby only a few of them are really big, including the Panataram temple, because there was a royal temple. But every other district had their own sort of temple. And they're really beautiful, but they're of course not as imposant and big as an Angkor Wat or a Borobudur. So that's just the way it is. Next slide. Now, he did this, I think, on a purpose, because he started to realize that he was in trouble. First click. So this is Majapahit here, and you got the three major trade routes, from East Indonesia, here from India through, say, where we are right now, the Strait of Malacca, Kedah was here, to Majapahit, and of course the Chinese came up as well. With the monsoons, you would go up and down the coast here and trade. But what was happening? Next clip. The Mongols started to come in. So Kublai Khan, having done all his way to almost Italy and Hungary, thought, I'm going to go to Southeast Asia now. So he moved into Vietnam and into Burma. The next step, of course, is that he would go further down and get control of the peninsula here, and therefore control over the Strait of Malacca. This was a problem, because if Kublai Khan would succeed, and literally would go to, say, where we are right now, Kuala Lumpur or Singapore, and have control there, all the trade from India would be directed straight to China, and he would have access to that. And Majapahit here, well, it would just dwindle and become a small town, and nothing would be, literally would be there. So this was an existential threat to Majapahit, and Kertanegara understood this. So what does he do? He, one more click, first he makes sure he doesn't get attacked in the back. So he goes to Bali, which was independent, he takes over Bali. Quite easy, he goes to Madura, takes that over as well. So that's safe. Then he puts his troops in what is now Kalimantan, and he sends them to what was called Sriwijaya still, Jambi, and he puts his troops over there as well. So military speaking, he is ready. If the Mongols are coming, he's ready. Bring it on. I'm ready. I can attack you from multiple sides. But that was not enough, because Kublai Khan, he had heard, was just being elevated to become a Buddha. Now, if you're a Buddha, then you have even more spiritual power. So Kertanegara thought, I need to do something like this as well. So, having united the lands, he says, I'm the first one who unites the lands. I need to have a ceremony in order to elevate myself to a sort of Buddha-Hindu, a Hindu-Buddha, a bit of both, so that everybody could be happy with that. Because then I have a kind of spiritual power. And he would imbue that spiritual power into patung, into statues, and set these statues to different locations, so to create a sort of spiritual halo over the whole land. And that's exactly what he does. Next slide. So, in order to do so, you have to dance naked in the middle of the night at a cemetery. That was the way to do this. So you can see the cemetery. This is esoteric sort of Buddhism, if you want to go into it, a Bhairava. But if you do that, you can create these particular powers. Next click. And you imbue that in some of these statues that are truly gigantic. This is about 6 meters tall. And then you send them to these regions to create that spiritual halo. And so he was military and spiritually ready to take on Kublai Khan. And he had unified the lands for the first time. Kalimantan, Sumatra, Java, Bali, all of them what we would call pretty much Indonesia now, large parts, he had unified them. And where do you have that ceremony? You do that in Murare, where that tamarind tree stood, where the guy was flying over the lands and got stuck into it 200 years earlier. So he has that ceremony in Murare in 1296 on the 21st of November, literally 2 days ago, and then another 700 years or so prior to us. So he has a big ceremony, and I would say if Indonesia has to choose at one particular point in time a birthday, that would be the birthday, 21st of November 1289. That is the Murare ceremony, the Murare ceremony that unified the lands for the very first time. Click. So this is what happened. This is how he looks like. You can see in the other picture he was a bit older, bit bigger on the waist and a little bit bolder on the head as well. This is how he looked like in a statue much younger. This statue is unfortunately stands simply in St. Petersburg in a warehouse. I got this picture from actually Leslie Pullen again, who's seen it, but unfortunately it's not visible. Next slide. So one click. So we get in 1289, we have the Murare ceremony. And now a lot of things happen very quickly. Because what happens is that he's got his army out there waiting for Kublai Khan. We go back almost 80 years when Kadiri and Singasari, those two brothers, were always fighting and were unified on the Kanarok. The Kadiri people have always felt, well, we're the ones who are not having the power here. Singasari is so important. Let's attack them right now because all the army is gone. So they attack. Very cleverly they do that as well. They attack Singasari and kill Kertanagara. So kill Kertanagara, this happened. But before that, 1290, I forgot actually the most dramatic story of it all. Kublai Khan sends a guy over to Java, and Mengchi is his name. And Mengchi has got a very simple message. Listen, you can do whatever you want. We don't really bother. You're the king here. Fine, you can do anything you want. You just have to kowtow to us. Just give me a few parrots and maybe something else, maybe one of your daughters as well. I'll bring her to Beijing, and we can at least claim that Majapahit, that the Southeast Asian archipelago, is now under the control of Kublai Khan as well. Really, you just do whatever you want. Kertanagara had nothing of it. He takes out a knife, probably gives it to somebody else. The guy's nose gets cut off. There's also a story his ear cut off, but it doesn't really matter too much. In either case, he's losing part of his limbs, his nose, I think. He goes back, and Kublai Khan is absolutely angry. He says, these people there in Southeast Asia, we're going to teach them we're going to give them a real damn good training. Right, we're going to go down and send thousands of people over in ships in order to attack them and subdue them and make sure that they understand that I am the most powerful man on the planet, which, to be honest, he was. There is actually a record in Vietnam. They see all the ships leaving and passing Vietnam, and they go, holy moly, what's going on here? Kublai Khan's navy is passing by, and thank God they're not coming to us. And they see them sailing on, but there's literally thousands of ships. Next click. Now, these people arrive, but by that time, so these admirals, there are 3 admirals that control the whole Mongol fleet. They arrive in, say, what is now Surabaya, and say, okay, we're ready to give this Kertanagara a good trashing. Where is he? He was killed already by his nephew who had attacked him because the army wasn't in East Java. So he's not really there. So they're confused. What are they going to do? And he gets the son-in-law of Kertanagara, Raden Wijaya is his name. He comes to the Chinese and says, listen, I'm not the king. I was supposed to become the king after Kertanagara. If you help me to kill these people in Kadiri, that have killed my father-in-law, I am very happy to submit myself. I'll go on my knees and say, Kublai Khan is the greatest guy of mankind. I will submit myself, and I'm happy, you're happy, everybody happy. But not the people in Kadiri. And the Chinese said, well, that's a good idea, let's do that. So they attack the city gets completely burned down, and they say, good, you have to submit yourself. But Raden Wijaya says, no, we do that tomorrow, tonight, we won a war, we party. Good. So he throws a big party in this new town, because Singasari, where the kingdom was, Kertanagara was burned down, so they had to build a new town. So they built a new town, and they called it Majapahit. And that was just an hour south of Surabaya. So there he is, they're having a good party, but Raden Wijaya is a tricky sort of character because he leaves his elite troops on the side, he waits until it's midnight and says, go out and take out the Chinese or take out the Mongols. And they kill him, it becomes mayhem. The admirals and the army, they flee back to their ships, and there they are. And they say, what are we doing here? We don't know the place, we don't really, it's dense jungle, we can't get through. Let's go back, the winds are good, let's go back to China. Right? And they sail back to China and they never come back. And Raden Wijaya sets up a ceremony to celebrate that they won in the new town, Majapahit. And Kertanegara had 4 daughters. They play a bit of a role as well, but one of them is on the background. But she plays an important role in the years thereafter. And I'll come back to this. Click one more time. Because the Mongol invasion goes horribly wrong, and if you click, there's a nice pictures of how these things look like in those days. That's the next one. On some of the Penataran temples, you can actually see the depiction of these wars, how these things happen. So you see elephants here, and there must have been doctors that came with ginger and past and stuff to give people as drinks to make them stronger, or help them, and swords to cut off their legs if things went horribly wrong. But we can see a bit of a depiction of what happened. But also, the Chinese brought the latest military technology with them, a cannon, a handheld cannon, a Chetbang. This is a picture, there's actually one in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. I have no idea how it got there, but it is there. But they brought cannons with them. So suddenly, this new empire, Majapahit, that is in a sort of expansionary mood later on, has got the latest military equipment as well, and that allows them to grow their empire. Now, what then happens is that one of the daughters of Kertanegara, Gayatri, is a short name, she's got names that are incredibly long, but her short name is Gayatri. She stands beside, in the background, and says, my father's dream of the unification of the lands, we need to make sure that this happens, that we bring that idea back. So Majapahit becomes a rising force, more and more trade, it has more influence across the region, it's got a big navy, because Kertanegara had to send these ships to Kalimantan, Sumatra and other places, so it has a big navy, it's got cannons. What she needs is somebody who can act on behalf of herself as a sort of commander. And that is a young, ambitious kind of guy who is called a rotting elephant, Gajah Mada. So he's, you don't want to stand in front of elephants that are, rotting, that are in a particular mood. So it is with this Gajah Mada. He becomes a very powerful man. In order to facilitate his career, there is a domestic rebellion. And this is a side story, but this is very important in Malaysia. In the domestic rebellion, he says to Gayatri and her daughter, who was the queen at the time, I will take care of this for you. Because he thinks if I do this, I can show you that military speaking, I'm in control of the army and you can promote me. And that happens. He attacks a particular place called Keta. And in it, there is a bit of trickery going on. You can find it in the book. But the very first mentioning ever of Malacca in history is there. This is in around 1325. There is a group of people that work with them, and they come from the place called Malacca. So for the first time, we know that Malacca existed at that particular time. Now that's a sort of domestic rebellion that he slashes down. He gets promoted, he becomes the vizier, the prime minister of basically Majapahit. And in 1330, he is kind of the guy who runs the show, and the king is born Hayam, and Hayam becomes the king 20, 30 years later, that really runs it as, in name, but it is Gajah Mada, that really runs it on a day-to-day basis. And this is a second weakness that Majapahit has. Not only was its location odd, and it couldn't respond to changes in trade flows over the years, it was also a government that was really dependent on its own personalities. And by the time we'll see that Gajah Mada dies, actually Hayam Wuruf didn't come off as a very strong king. I think he was actually quite weak, although he's gone into Indonesian history as this powerful king that controlled Majapahit. But as soon as Gajah Mada falls away, you actually see signs of the outer regions to fall away. But that's much later. Gajah Mada eventually says, I will do Palapa. We don't know what that means, Palapa, by the way, but maybe it's He wouldn't do anything with his wife, or maybe he wouldn't eat vegetables for a long time. We just don't know what it is. But he says, I will do palapa until all the following lands are under our control. And then he basically says everything from, give or take, Phuket and Kedah and Malaysia and Singapore to Masek is being mentioned, Jera and Kedah, so that's just north of here, Sumatra, Java, and East Indonesia until, say, Brunei, that whole area, he says, that will be under my control, and he sends armies there, and it was probably under his control. They had a very strong navy and were in control of the waterways in between. The kingdom rises, got some beautiful old remnants there. If you ever want to go for a nice holiday somewhere, fly to Surabaya, go down, see some of the old temples that are still there. They're really impressive. Penataran is really, really nice. You have to go to Blitar. And that kingdom rises. It was a bit of an odd kingdom because, I think that's the next slide. Because, so this is supposedly Gajah Mada. Obviously, we don't know how it looked like, but an historian in the 1950s presumably was asked by Sukarno, can you give the guy a face so we know what we're talking about? They wanted to visualize it, and they took a random terracotta thing and said, this must be Gajah Mada. We have no idea how it looked like, but for some people, they still use this picture. It is what it is. Next slide. And this is the area that they under control. But there is a funny thing with it, because I do believe that they had a lot of influence over the waterways. They had the navy, they had the cannons, they could do so. They left a lot of these outer regions, they left that kind of under their own sort of control. But domestically, on the land, they were not that strong. So Sunda, West Java, I think was never under their control. So they could control Brunei and maybe even places like what was Kuala Lumpur at the time, but nearby in the mountains, they didn't really go there. Why do we know that? Because Gajah Mada, frustrated with that he can't get Sunda under control, what does he do? He says to Hayawuruk, you're going to marry with the princess of Sunda. Now for Sunda, those people, that was like, wow, gee, fantastic. We are being elevated to the most powerful status in the region, right? They go to Majapahit to get their daughter married. Gajah Mada then tells them, yeah, but hey, she's a concubine, right? She's not the wife. And they are upset. No, there goes horribly wrong, and a battle occurs between the Sundanese and Majapahit. Yeah, Majapahit almost loses, at least so say the Sundanese in their accounts. So it's all a bit tricky. Majapahit almost loses, but anyway, here we go. It sets up a sort of funny split between West Java and the rest of Java that is still around these days. When I did a book talk in Bandung, this was what people wanted to talk about. Oh, the Battle of Bubak, what do you think happened there? And the people in West Java, when they talk about Javanese people, they're talking about Central and East Java. They don't talk about West Java. So that separation, to a certain extent, is still around. Also, and I think this is the next picture, what we see on the temples, we see how life was. But one of the things that, and I use this particular picture here, Hayawuruk is the most powerful man in the whole Southeast Asian region at the time, and people send him all kinds of presents from, say, what is now here, Malaysia and southern Thailand and Brunei. He had to travel in East and Central Java around to make sure that these people still listened to him and that they saw him. Every year, for 3 months, he was on the road. It was hard work as a king, because in Java itself, he didn't have as much of influence, maybe, as his navy had on the sea. So he had to really work hard for it. And in one of these travels around the lands, there's a guy called Prapancha. He's a son of the head of the Buddhist community, and he's a writer. And he writes down what he saw. And he calls his book A Journey of the Lands, if you want to call it like that, Desawanana, but it's known in Indonesian history as the Negara Kertagama. And that book was in a library, and even Prapancha says at the end of his own book, there's a couple of things he felt he was a failure. He couldn't find a woman. He had a girlfriend, and the girlfriend said at one point in time to him, you smell, and you are not really romantic. He writes that down. So he's given up on finding a lady in his life, and he thinks his book, which is a description of the lands, is utterly boring. And he's not going to be on bestseller. So he says, well, yeah, nobody's going to read my stuff ever. And here we are, 700-800 years later, unbeknownst to him, it is now probably one of the most important books for Indonesian history. His book.
Can I just break it out? Because he's my favourite character in the book. I mean, Pancha is a kind of a link through a lot of the episodes. And it was so wonderful to have this person who I knew of before. I'd heard of him called Pancha, and I knew he was the person behind the curtain. But he was just a monk, you know. But Herald brings him to life. And I was about to say, but did you make up those bits about him never being able to get a girlfriend, or being a bit smelly, or the fact that he loved palm wine? And let's face it. It was. He's such an engaging and endearing character because he's a loser, really, but a very, very important loser. And I don't think I want you to go past that point because there are so many moments in the book when we meet these kind of people. So really, how much invention is there? That's my question.
No, the funny thing, so he is the only man of which we know something from those days. We know, of course, kings and they're written on stone, but he's the only one who writes this whole story. And in the story, he does allude that he seems to like palm wine, because at one point in time, the king says, well, okay, we're going to camp here for the night. They do this big tour around, and he says, okay, I felt like it was time for a bit of palm wine. So he wasn't as Buddhist, I think, as probably a lot of Buddhists would be these days. He was quite flexible in these things. So we can see that, but at the end of the book, he makes some comments about himself. He couldn't find a woman. He thought his book was utterly going to be boring. He didn't have the support for somebody like, we are here at Kinokuniya to bring the book to you, but he felt that you needed royal support to get the book known, and he didn't, nobody in court thought this book was, they didn't want to even be associated with it. So eventually he liked books, we know that as well, because his father, who was supposed to go on this tour with Hayam Wuruk, but he's old, and he says, I can't do this anymore, can you do this in my name? So this is why he makes the tour around, but he says, can you meet this friend of mine? He's got a beautiful library. And in that trip to that library, and I'm going off the course of here, he suddenly writes in his own book, I went to see my father's friends, and he had a beautiful library, and he told me the story. And suddenly it became all clear to me. And then the next verse says something, I went back to Hayam Wuruk and Gajah Mada and told them, we have to go to Kakenengan. Now Kakenengan is the place, we don't know where it is anymore, but Ken Arok was interred, where he was remembered. So we think that when he went to see his father's friend, that he got the history of Hayam Wuruk's story that goes back to the 1220s from Ken Arok, that he listened to it and says, oh my God, now I understand what the history of the king is. And he tells that to the king, and they make a detour there. Oh, that's actually two chapters.
It's such a human moment, and I just wanted you to realize that he's such a voice in the story that you feel he's reaching back from them.
Yes.
And he's telling the story to us now.
He's a beautiful character. I actually had a small statue that I seen in a museum. I made a picture of him and used that description of him as a bald guy with big earlobes and an earring in it and things as such. So that's the guy I had in mind to write about. Next one. So this is Penataram. This is the state temple of the Hayam Wuruk of Majapahit, close to Blitar. This is really beautiful. I made this picture at 5 in the morning. This is my wife. She doesn't know that she's being photographed there, right on the edge. It's a very beautiful state. And this was built by Hayam Wuruk. There's a date in it. It's called the Data Temple. And it was done in the days of Hayam Wuruk. Nobody goes here. If you go to Borobudur these days, you've got to buy a ticket and line up and these sort of things. Prambanan is quite busy as well. I've been here multiple times. Every time I ask the Juru Kunchi, the guy who runs the place, to look in the book of the names of the people that have been there. 5 people, 6 people a day. Nobody really goes there. So it's a pity because it's a beautiful complex. It's being used for movies sometimes in the back as well. But it was a funny sort of empire whereby it's almost like a donut. In the outskirts, on the seas, they were strong. On land, they were much less strong. Close to where they had the royal palace, Majapahit, they were probably very influential. But even West Java, they couldn't really get under control. So it's a very strange sort of setup that they had. Next one. Now, on these temples, we also see what life was. And that allows us, as a writer, to say, oh, this is how they looked. They lived on small pavilions and they had animals playing around. These are the dresses that they have. And there is an important sort of Netflix series that they had in those days that was really the thing that everybody wanted to watch. And I come to that. This is the next slide. On the stories of these temples, there's a story that was, as I said, the Netflix of the day, a Panji story. Panji is a prince. This is purely story. He's a prince. He's going to marry a princess. We got thousands of these sort of stories. The princess is far away. He needs to look for her. He travels through the lands. He meets also the women. It's a very erotic sort of story. He meets also the women. He's got all sorts of relationship with them. But in the end, he meets his princess. They get married and is happily living after and these sort of things. These Panji stories, they were extremely popular. So popular that some of the kings said, "Can you put them into stone?" And you can actually follow the story. Here, he's got a bit of a intimate moment with a lady here. He's playing music as well. And the intimate moment continues a little bit here. So it's all in there. And the traders that came there, they took these stories back home to Malaysia, Brunei, and Thailand. And if you go to Bangkok and you look at some of the palaces there on the murals, there are Panji stories there. But they call them in Thailand Ina. But the name has changed, but the stories are exactly the same. Next one. So there's a cultural legacy as well. There's just a chapter heading. Now, Majapahit goes down. Gajah Mada dies. Effectively, he was a strong man. They didn't have really strong institutions. We see that actually Hayabur can't keep things under control. The Chinese start to poke in it a little bit actually. And some of the outskirts of Brunei already sends a letter to the Chinese, says, "We have a deal with you," to Majapahit, to send them camphor wood every year, but we're willing to send it to you if you tell Majapahit that we have a new deal. So they look for the protection of the Chinese. That works, and the outskirts actually start to fall away. There is then also a fight within the family. They make the same mistake again as this Langa guy did, of fighting within the family. There's a civil war in the early 1400s, and its power falls off the cliff quite quickly. There's a lady, again, a powerful lady called Suhita, who's got a beautiful statue. We spoke about this not too long ago. I don't have the statue here, she's actually in here, but who tries to put everything together again, but she fails, she passes away, and to be honest, after 1470 or so, we don't really know what was there anymore. And then the Muslim empires rise and they come in.
I'm going to stop there again because we've heard of a few different women mentioned who are all women of either great power or certainly great influence.
Yes.
Is this you?
Wrong
one, that's good. And I, as a woman reading this, was fascinated by the number of women who held real power at this time. Harold's concentrated on the male strength, of course, that's always there. But there are 4 women in this book that stand out to me. There's the poor Candedes, who is the wife of the wicked Ken Arok, who is a victim, but she gets her revenge.
Yes.
Ladies, she gets her revenge.
20 years waiting and then
she gets him in the end. But then the other 3 women, there's Gayatri who was mentioned, Tibuana, and then eventually Suhita, who we don't know much about, but we have some amazingly beautiful statuary of her, which makes it look like she was a very, very dearly loved person, even if we don't know much about her story. What does that say about this area at the time? And when I look back to my English history, I'm thinking, well, queens, who can I think of? I have to get to like Elizabeth I in the 16th century before I get to something. And she only stayed queen because she was the virgin queen, because the minute you let a man into your life, that sidelined you. And yet these women had real influence and power and actually led the story sometimes.
Yeah, I think some of these women, Candace was a kind of a beauty queen who was, she was kidnapped because somebody eventually takes her revenge by telling her son that her husband is not a biological father and gives him a knife. No, that sets him up already. So he actually murdered your real father, and she gives him a knife, and also a magical knife. But in particular, other ones like Gayatri, Tribuana, and Suhita, I completely agree. They were very powerful women who were on the background, and you see them coming forward in the stories once in a while, but also in statues and reliefs. And they seem to be the power brokers who had things under control, very much as it is in my household as well, I think. So they were very powerful. Yeah. And Gayatri, I think some of these women were very intelligent, but they lived in a brutal environment where these men were waging wars and stuff. but they knew how to play the game very, very well. So they sometimes kept the whole thing together. Gayatri initially with the help of Gajamada and Surita later on as well. But Majapahit falls away, Muslim empires arise on northern Java, eventually they walk over it. By the 1400s there's a West Javanese monk prince. He's a prince, but he wants to turn into a monk. He walks over the whole of Java and back again. And he doesn't hardly mention it. He goes to Buban, he goes to Majapahit, he just passes it. And this is actually when we still think that Majapahit must have been somewhat around. But it was dwindled, the trade routes changed, they went to northern Java, Malacca was emerging as a new empire as well. So the traders didn't really go there anyway, it was a difficult place to get. And they didn't respond to that, they had the wrong people to respond to it, everything went wrong basically. And there you go, it shriveled, it became a shadow of itself, and Majapahit falls away. But eventually, Raffles is there, and he hears. And he's got some Dutch people as well. They said, we've heard about this Majapahit sort of thing. Of course, there were farmers that living there, but all these temples were literally in forest. The funny thing is, the Dutch went in, and when they found stuff in the forest, they said, that's fantastic. That goes into my garden. So literally, they took it in the garden and shipped it back home in Holland, where we have a lot of statues that only literally 2 or 3 months ago literally have come back to Jakarta and are being at display in the National Museum in Jakarta now, hundreds of years later. But this is a statue of a big place that he had drawn, Raffles. When he was there looking for Majapahit, he missed it actually. He went to Singasari, but where real Majapahit was, he didn't even go there. Next slide. So it was a bit of a story, people heard about it, hey, there were some temples, but nobody knew. Until 1880, the Dutch have a war with the Balinese in Lombok. That in itself is a big story, let's not go into there, but anyway, there's a war in Lombok, and the Dutch army attacks a Balinese compound. And there's, in the Dutch troops, there's a guy who came there because he heard there's a library. And he goes in, and the library's on fire, so he literally goes around, grabs the books, these books are written on lontar leaves, he grabs them, puts them on a bull cart, and brings them to Jakarta, and he's a specialist in Kawi, the old language, and he translates them, and thank God he picked up the book from Prapancha, the monk, who had written the story in 1365 about him traveling with Hayam Guru. So suddenly, they understand what has happened, there's a story there, and there were some other stories they heard, but they weren't quite sure, but they get confirmed with this now. And therefore, all sorts of archaeological digs are being made in the 1920s. And gradually, Majapahit came back to life again. And now we go. This is the war, the picture of the war there. Next slide, and I think that's the last one. Yes. And Majapahit, in a sense, is still today. And in the war where Kertanegara was being attacked by his nephew, there is written that the army of what became Majapahit went out there with their banners, red and white. So the flag, the Malay colors, the Majapahit army used red and white as the indication, which of course are popular colors still in this part of the world. We have the stories in Bangkok on the wats in the temples. The Balinese eventually, when the Muslims ran over, they put all their stuff, the Majapahit people put their stuff, some of them went to Yogyakarta, some of them maybe went up to here to Malaysia, but a lot of them went to Bali, which is why Bali is Hindu, Buddhist at the moment, which is why Prapancha's book went to Bali and eventually ended up in Lombok. But one thing, and this is really something that I normally say in Indonesia, if there's one lesson that we can take, maybe for a country like Indonesia going forward, is that the weakness of Majapahit, in the end, was that they didn't have strong institutions. They were dependent on a couple of these powerful women, and a guy like Gajamada and Kertanegara, who were able to consolidate power, to bring things together, and become very powerful and influential. But as soon as these people died, you can actually see that the whole thing starts to fall again, apart again. So it was the institutions that they didn't really build up for some time. And the last thing that we can learn as well, and I think this part of the world has good lessons from where I originally come from, Holland, is that there has never been a problem with them between the Buddhists and the Hindus and later the Muslims. The religions, the differences of the people that came Chinese, Indian, or whatever, that sort of tolerance, that acceptance of all these differences is something that became very natural. We see there's no evidence whatsoever anywhere that we see that there are tensions in Majapahit because of this. And this is still, to a large extent, I think, the case in Indonesia, a very tolerant place. And some of these tolerant Indonesians took me up as a backpacker early on in the 1990s. And this is why I fell in love with this particular place. So that tolerance, I think, is still a sort of lesson that maybe this part of the world has for other parts of the world where maybe tolerance is a bit more under pressure, such as my own country, where we struggle with these things at the moment. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's absolutely wonderful. And obviously having the pictures there is so important. I don't want to keep people too long, but I do want to give you all a chance to ask any questions you've got. So I've got I've got this microphone. Maybe if I could use this one.
Yeah.
If anybody's got a question, I'll bring a microphone round to. So please, don't hesitate if there's anything you'd like to ask us. This is your chance.
If you don't have a question, you can reach me out on social media as well. And that's what you need to do as writers these days, to get your book out there in front of you.
Nobody there with anything bursting to say? I must admit you've covered everything. I thought I'd be stopping you a lot more, but it was just a very captivating
I've worked on it for years, so the opportunity to talk about it is, I gotta relish that, right? There is a question. Why don't I give the microphone to you for a second?
Were women able to exert power up front, or did they have to use men in front of them?
Women would be? I think, so there was this rebellion where the first time the people from Malacca were involved. It's the first time that Malacca is being mentioned in historical documents. The funny thing is, Tribuana, again, clever lady, she sends all the men up front, says you fight, you attack, and by the time they're attacking, she arrives as well, just last moment, probably from a safe distance, let them do the dirty work. She then proclaims, being the army commander, that she did this thing, she won, she went back to Majapahit and says, I took care of this particular situation, but Gajimara helped me, and he now gets a promotion, and this is how he rose. So they were very clever to play the game, I think, in that way. Gayatri is being kidnapped when she's a younger girl, and she hides and becomes a pembantu, what's it in English, a domestic helper. As a princess, as a domestic helper, she works as a domestic helper for about a year, until people see her and says, my goodness, you are the daughter of Negara. And then she gets elevated again, but she waits to come out of hiding until it's, of course, safe for her. But she's willing, she's able to step away from this sort of elevated, nice presence that she had with baths and rose water and good food. And I'm not sure it's me. And is able to adapt herself. And we see later in her life that she does that once again. So I think it strikes me a very intelligent woman, very adaptable, intelligent, knowing how to play the game, be patient. The other one is Candedes. She is the beauty of the lands. So one of the kings says, my God, that's the beauty of the land, that's mine. He kidnaps her. She's got to marry him. Then Ken kills him, takes her as a wife. She had nothing to say about this. And she waits for 20 years until she says, that's not your biological father, by the way, he killed your real father, and here's a knife. And that was the end of her life. I suspect she had to burn herself when her husband died. The tradition was the sati, you would throw yourself into the fire. So she knew that this was coming, but this was her final sort of revenge. So these ladies came over as knowing how to play the game very well. So,
I was fascinated by, in the museum in Jakarta, when you have the great statues of the king. There's always the wife is equal size.
yeah.
In other civilizations, you get the wife is there, but she's always either
smaller
or sitting on his shoulder or something like that.
Yeah.
But they are given equal, and they're wearing equal bling, and so I think they carry a great deal of symbolic and divine power.
Yes, for whatever reason it was, they were able to exert themselves very well. Maybe through their own sort of intelligence, knowing how to play the game, but maybe maybe simply it was very well accepted. There's no science or laws that thinks that women could not get things or something like that. Even if you go back to the Singasari days, inheritances could go from father to son, but part of it would be carved out for women. So women were not treated as a sideshow in that regard. So that was quite common. And to a certain extent, seems to be still the case, at least in my own family. I have a question here.
Malacca was first mentioned in 1330.
Yeah, so there's a rebellion in 1328, on the top of my head. It's in the book, I can quickly look it up. 1328, where Gajah Mada and Tribhuwana are there. This is in far East Java, southern coast of East Java, a place called Keta. And there it is written, there is a guy from Malacca, they called it, slightly differently spelled in those days, right? So the belief is that there must have been people from Malacca. So Malacca must have already emerged as a sort of trading town.
Not 1400, like our textbooks.
This is
Really?
100 years earlier. This is 1330s. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, because the promotion of Gajah Mada thereafter is in 1330.
so that mouse deer under the Malacca tree story isn't real.
Well, I'm not 100% sure. We just know that it's the first mention of Malacca. And there's a bit of debate on how you translate the word because it's all Kawi and these sort of things. But it looks like Malacca was already emerging and was probably by the time powerful enough to say, we send some troops as a sort of representation, like other countries do now. If the US has got a war, other countries who are affiliated with it provide some troops as well. So I suspect something like that was the case. Then helping Majapahit out as part of getting something out of it for themselves. So they were powerful in a sense
That's
already.
certainly a Malaysian hot potato, that one, that big.
If Malacca was such a vast empire, why didn't it have like a Borobudur or Angkor Wat? You know?
Malacca is a fast empire. It comes later because it's actually that the trade route shift. Majapahit dies, you
Yeah.
could say, and then the Muslims take more control over the trade in northern Java, and of course they traded through Malacca. It was only in the 1630s.
Yeah, it's
when the
111
Dutch
years,
attacked.
but there's nothing to show for it now.
Buildings there.
Yeah.
I saw some of the homes.
No?
I saw the script that you saw, Prapancha's.
Yes, the writing of Prapancha.
Yeah. So you said the language was Kawi,
Hmm.
and that's all Javanese. Right?
Yeah. So just to give you a very quick.
And were there other books that was written, and
Yeah.
were there other manuals that was
Yeah.
available?
So these were written on lonta leaves, and they had to be rewritten, recopied every 75 to maybe 100 years, as long as you kept them well, because they could be eaten and humidity would eat them right. These books were then racked up, you can still see them in between wood. So there's a stack of them, and you can roll them out, and then the Kawi is written on it. Kawi is a kind of proto-Javanese, and Kawi itself comes from Palawan. That is an Indian language that came in, say, the archipelago around 500-600, then merged with local languages, and eventually became Kawi, and then eventually became Javanese. So if you speak Javanese, you can't speak Kawi. It's a very different language, but there is a small group of academics that still study it. There are more books of these that have survived the centuries, and very often it's the books that people wanted to survive, because every, say, century they had to say, okay, which of the books are we going to copy now, because sometimes they didn't feel like this book is, I don't know, not so relevant, skip it. It's interesting that the Balinese continued to copy the book that Prapancha thought himself was a bit of a, no, not going to be a bestseller, was a bit of a loser, probably because they saw Majapahit as their predecessor. So they thought, this is something from our own people. We want to translate this. And when I gave a book presentation in Bali, there was a journalist there who said, it's so funny, Prapancha, the character, says, because here in Bali, he is half God. He's the one who created Balinese culture. He's the Buddhist and Hindu guy that brought this all over. And you write about him as if he had problems with women and was drinking a bit too much. He says, I would never be able to write that. They would burn down my house. That's what he literally said. So he's still revered in Bali to a large extent.
We're running out of time, so one more question. I think this gentleman over here, can we pass the microphone to this one?
I'll pass you this one. You will have me pass it over.
Can I ask you a question? If the Hindu empire of Majapahit was preceded by the Buddhist empire of Srivijaya, which was the empire that was controlling the ancient Kedoram of Kedaram in 2000 years ago.
I just went to Kedah. There's actually a gentleman here in the crowd who's going to read the book about Kedah. So, both Hindu and Buddhist influences came around 500-600 into this part of the world. Srivijaya was a rising power at the time. And it looked like the islands around the archipelago, like Bangka, for example, they were Vishnu empires, so they were Hindu. While on land, Srivijaya, Palembang, Jambi, they would tend to be more Buddhist in nature. It is that sort of influence that then eventually went into Java. Both Buddhist and Hindu. I mean, they built in 800, the biggest Buddhist temple in the world is Borobudur. It stands there, and next to it, 30 kilometers, is the second largest Hindu temple on the planet. I think the second largest was prominent, right? So, but the sort of Buddhism that went into Java was a very esoteric sort of Buddhism that stressed mantras and sayings and wordings and particular ceremonies that then eventually lived on as well, as we've seen with Kirtanagara as well. That's something that really caught the attention at the time. So that, and I think Kedah, as far as I know, but I'm not sure, that was what I've seen there, was both Hindu and Buddhist as well. I've seen the Buddhist temples. I actually made a picture of the Buddhist monks there 2 days ago in the mountains who came all the way from Thailand to visit it. So it's both these influences that came. But the funny thing is that in Java, they never really made a distinction. There are temples in Java, one is called Jawi, that is Buddhist from the bottom, is Hindu from the bottom, and Buddhist at the top, the stupa at the top. So they merged the two. They didn't see necessarily as separate. They thought, you can blend it all a bit together, like a nice lemak sort of thing. And that worked very well for them. So all these ceremonies and things, they blended them in their own way and threw in their sort of own sort of spice as well, and created something uniquely Javanese out of it. Yeah.
Well, as much as we'd like to carry on all day, it is time now for us to wind up. There will be an opportunity to meet Herald if you've got a question, if you want to get your book signed. He's been here for a while yet. But I would like to say thank you very, very much to Herald for such a very comprehensive presentation on top of an extremely readable book. So I do encourage you to please support him and buy it, because it really is worthwhile. I'd also like to thank Kina Kinnear. We've got Jet somewhere hiding. She's over there. Mm-hmm. She's not even listening, but she is very much behind allowing us to be here today. So we do thank Kina Kinnear, particularly Jet. It's very busy on a Saturday afternoon, so it's very good of them to give us this space. And most of all, I want to thank you for coming and then staying and then growing as a crowd as the talk went on. I do appreciate it very, very much. Thank you very much again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rose.
Waited all my life for a book about Majapahit. That wasn't a very scholarly one, but one that was accessible to everybody. In fact, the lady here at Kina Kinnear, Jet, has just said exactly the same thing. She's over there. Thank you very much, Kina Kinnear. And she just said, I've been waiting all my life for this, so I hope you will find that you've been waiting all your life for this too. Herald van der Linde, our author today, is a man of many parts, if I can say that. He's Dutch. He was born in a small Dutch place called Almelo in eastern Netherlands. And he is a rather circuitous story as to how he came to be here today. I'm not going to steal his best stories, however, but just to give you a very brief bio. It's his birthday today, so happy birthday, Herald. And he eventually went on to university, where he studied economics, not history, so he has no background as a historian to start off with. And because he's so smart, he managed to finish his studies at a very early age, I managed to wangle his student loan to set him on a travelling spree. So first of all he went to Ireland, and then he decided on Indonesia. So eventually he ended up as a tourist in Indonesia, met an Indonesian family, typically of Indonesia. They said, "Oh, come stay." So he stayed for 6 months. And in that 6 months he learnt Indonesian and began on a lifelong love of Jakarta and Indonesia. But obviously that's only his private life. In his public life, he eventually went back and became a proper working person. He was in fact an economic analyst. So he spent most of his working life dealing with all sorts of things that I know nothing about, but all to do with money. And spent some time in Indonesia, where he got himself his first job. And then eventually went from Indonesia to South Africa, so he's got some years in South Africa, then to Taiwan, finally Hong Kong, and it's there in Hong Kong where he's based now. But of course, because during his time in Indonesia he met the lovely Tenny, his wife, who's right in the middle. She stole his heart, and that meant Jakarta has always been his second home. So although they're living at the moment in Hong Kong, that's where he's based. So eventually, Herald, I'm trying to let him get settled. Eventually, Herald wrote a book about Jakarta, but this year he's published his work on Majapahit, which is obviously, if you've read it as I have, the result of years of research. It is a book that is deeply, deeply well researched, and I say that as a historian myself. It isn't a novel, but it reads like one. It's a page turner, and it's the most wonderful mixture of all the known historical knowledge, which is fragmentary at the best, with local legend, with tradition, with some of the great works of classical literature, and a certain amount of imagination. And it's made it into a really coherent, wonderful read. So it's the kind of book that if you're reading it at night, instead of sending you to sleep, you have to go on to the next chapter, and the next chapter, and the next chapter. It's what I would call the Indonesian Game of Thrones, with that lecture appetite. So now, with no more listening to me, I want to pass over to Herald now. And I want him perhaps to tell us a little bit more about his journey and how he got there through the medium of this wonderful presentation he's put together for us. Afterwards, there will be time for Q&A for you, so if you've got your questions, hang on to it till the end. I, however, because I'm the boss with the microphone, may interrupt